right, so this is the fourth video lecture on social class. The last one I wrapped up talking about Weber's power, property, and prestige definition of social class. Now I want to move on to talk about Marx, and one of Marx's, I guess, Eric Wright would have been a Marxian. He was one of his, what do you call them, proteges. But Marx basically, and I hope I get a chance to talk about him in another chapter, Karl Marx basically argued that there are there's two social classes. It's really that simple. It's not a matter of all of these subjective, qualitative elements of power and property, but there are two groups. There are the people that own the means of production and the people that work in the means of production. In other words, there's the owners of the factory, the owners of the business, the owners of the store, the owners of the thing that makes the money, right? The owners of the farm, the owners of whatever, and then there are the people that work there. So there's really two groups. There's the means of production. This is a really important term. It's a very important sociological term. The means of production is a fancy way of saying the thing that makes the money, right? The factory, the farm, the store, the cows, whatever. And the thing that makes the money, and what is your relationship to that thing that makes the money? Do you own it, right? Do you own it and then you use it to generate wealth for yourself, or do you work there? Or do you go to the means of production and do the thing and then get paid for your time, for the 8 hours of your life? Or do you own the thing that makes the money and pay other people? So there's two groups. I don't think it's in this chapter, there's the proletariat and the bourgeois. The proletariat are the proletariat are the workers, and the bourgeois are the owners. Sometimes I use the analogy of a pimp and the prostitute. It's not a perfect example, but the prostitute is obviously would obviously be the proletariat, the one that's doing the work, but it's the pimp who's making the money on the prostitute doing the work. So maybe you've also heard the term bougie. Bougie comes from the concept of bourgeois, right? They're the owners of the factory. Now, Wright. Wright says, it's not quite that simple, old Carl, it's more complicated than just these two groups. And Wright broke it down into four groups. So Wright broke it down into these four groups of people in the relative to the means of production. You have the people at the top, right? You have the owners. I don't know if you can see that. I need to use a bigger marker. You have the owners of the factory or the farm. These are the capitalists, right? The very, very tip top. They're the ones that own everything. And of course you have the workers at the bottom, right? These are these are the workers. But you also have this group kind of in the middle. And these are the managers. So I like to ask a class if we're here in the middle. These are the managerial class. And the managerial class, I always like to ask a group, like, have you ever been a manager? Have you ever been assistant manager? Did you like it? And what's interesting is how many students will say, no, they didn't like to be a manager. Well, why didn't you like it? Well, it was too much work. I was always feeling torn. And this is what Wright called a contradictory class location. Because if you think about, say, the manager at a Dairy Queen, or I'll just use a store I used to work at, the manager at the Goodwill. The manager at the Goodwill is both a worker, which means he's being exploited by the corporation, but he's also an exploiter, because the manager has to say to the workers, you need to work harder, you need to produce more things, you need to sell more, right? So he's telling the people beneath him, I need to get more work out of you. Because the more work I get out of you, the better I look as the manager. And I need to look good as the manager because I'm being exploited by the people at the top. So in essence, the managers are both exploiter and exploited. This is the reason, like in labor unions, once you become like a team lead or a manager, you can't join the union because you are basically one of them. You are one of the owners. You are exploiting the rest of us. You're not a worker bee anymore. And this is why I called it a contradictory, because you're both. And this can be very difficult. This can create a cognitive dissonance for the person who's in the middle. And so anyway, but the point is that there's more than three classes. And then there's the petty bourgeois, right? So here you have the capitalists, they're the owners, you have the managers, the people in the middle, and the workers, the working class, the ones that do the work of the work. But you also have some people who are both owner and worker. If you own your own restaurant, if you own your own bookstore, you are both the owner and you're the worker, right? So are you exploited or exploiter, or do you exploit yourself, right? And this is what he called the petty bourgeois. And the petty bourgeois can relate to the capitalist, but they can also relate to the worker. So they're a whole different class. We typically use in this culture this model right here. Typically, when we talk about class, we're talking about this sociological model of social class. And how does it go? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Five steps. And we can talk about the merits of this scale, but we have the upper class, and this is a wee bit outdated. If you were to look at these income brackets, they're probably pretty low. But at the very top, you would have the upper class, or the capitalist class. And then amongst that group of people, you probably have even some ranking there, because you have the old money versus the new money. The old money are the people that inherited the wealth from others, and the new money are the people that recently became wealthy. The old money people learned how to be in their class, and the new money people are kind of having to adjust, right? Because if you think about, and this is the way I like to think about social class, you can think about social class as being their own different little cultures. That you have the people at the top, they do certain things, they surround themselves by certain material objects, which is very different than the way, maybe even talk different, right? They interact different. And the people at the bottom, they spend their days doing different things. They may talk different. They'll surround themselves by different things. And that's the definition of a culture, right? The definition of a culture is the way I think, stuff that I have around me. Yeah, okay. So you got the upper class, and then you got the middle. I kind of think this is funny because we break the middle class down into an upper middle class and a lower middle class, which I think is kind of funny. But we also in our culture tend to think of our culture as a very middle class culture. But in fact, the middle class is getting smaller and smaller. The wealthy is getting wealthier and wealthier, and they're moving further and further away. And the poor is actually the lower class. So there's this bigger gap. And this is, if you want to think of it kind of like an hourglass, this is getting smaller and smaller in between. Right, this part right here, if you were to think of this as a social structure, this is actually getting smaller. And then you've got the lower class, and we even break the lower class down into different groups. We have the working class, which as a descendant of working class people, and probably a working class person myself, I'm a little insulted that we put lower working people, but these are the ones that their income and their livelihood is based on their work. They go to work, they work on the road construction, they build the buildings, they're the welders, they're the they're the truck drivers. Their wealth, their income, they work and they get paid based on their work, right? As opposed to the privilege, their wealth, they don't work necessarily, and their wealth and their status is generated by their stocks, their bonds, their businesses. And then you have the working poor, and the working poor are also workers, right? They're also working class, but they're working, but their wages, they're still poor. So they may be working 2, 3 jobs, but their wages are not high. So they may be making 10, well, in our culture, 10, 12, $13 an hour, and they're still officially poor. But they're working, but they're still poor. So we call them the working poor. And then at the very bottom, you have a group that, which is also kind of an insulting label, is the underclass. And the underclass are people that are less likely to be attached to employment. So they may be disabled, they may be homeless, you can be homeless though and also be working. I knew a guy who was a custodian at the university, and he was living on the streets. And he quit. And he quit because he said being on his feet all day at work and then sleeping on the sidewalk was too hard on his body. So he was not able to maintain his job because he didn't have a place to sleep, right? And how often do we think about, well, you have to have a job in order to have a place to sleep? But what we also have seen is that if we provide places for people to sleep, they'll be more likely to maintain a job. And I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. That's for another slide, another lecture. So anyway, you can sort of look at this. There's also references in the textbook about the different ways that we break down social class. I'm going to stop here, and when I come back, I want to talk about some theory and some, let's see, theories, consequences of class, etc., etc.